There are two types of museums in the world. The first type are the museums that are built deliberately, with artifacts and objects from the ancient and modern world stashed away inside them for safekeeping. The second type are the museums that have been created by accident after buildings, towns, and cities become abandoned. The people who used to use them have long since gone away, but the buildings and facilities are still standing. This video will take you on a tour of some of the most astonishing abandoned places in the world. Our collection of stories begins with the Racton Tower in Chichester, West Sussex, England. This abandoned, ruined structure has been standing on the land here for such a long time that even the people who live close to it have mostly forgotten its origin. To tell the truth, calling it a ruin is doing it a disservice. Most ruins tend to be the shattered remains of buildings that were once complete. Racton Tower was never finished in the first place. The building was commissioned by the 2nd Earl of Halifax and built by architect Theodosius Keene, who started work in 1766 and finally gave up in 1775. By that point, he'd built an 80-foot tall tower with a distinctive triangular base and circular turret. Nobody knows why the Earl wanted it built. One theory says that it was to be his summer house, while another says it was simply somewhere for him to watch his ships dock at Emsworth Port. Aside from not knowing why work was started, we also don't know why it was stopped. Maybe the Earl just got tired of waiting. Today, the supposedly haunted tower is a favorite place to visit for many British ghost hunters. Speaking of supposedly cursed or haunted abandoned buildings, here's Castelao da Cunha in Palmeira, Portugal. Work began on the Grand Mansion in 1915, under the guidance of architect Ernesto Corradi. But it quickly became apparent that his client, João José Ferreira Rego, didn't have the necessary funds to see the project through to completion. He'd requested a wide range of architectural influences in the design, including Arabian, Gothic, Romantic, and Neoclassic. But such a specialist work comes at a high price, and João didn't have the means to cover the costs. It's thought that he was attempting to impress his wife, Francesca Piexto de Souza, who imported the Brazilian plants and trees that surround the property from her home country. With her husband running out of cash, the couple divorced in 1919, and work on the magnificent home stopped. There were rumors that Francisca's former lover placed a curse on the place, wishing for it never to be finished or inhabited. Over 100 years later, it appears that he got his wish. The castle's ownership has changed hands several times in the past century, but work has never been resumed. It's hard to imagine this by looking at the shattered ruins of the building today, but Forest Haven Asylum in Fort Meade, Maryland, was once considered to be among the most advanced and ethical mental health treatment facilities in the United States of America. By the time it closed its doors, it had deteriorated so badly that it was known as America's most deadly mental institution. The facility opened in 1925 with a focus on providing residents with a stable environment in which they could live and work on the communal farm. By the 1960s, though, much of the funding that Forest Haven relied on had been withdrawn, and it was struggling to make ends meet. Experienced members of the staff left to be replaced by novices or people with no relevant skills or experience, so standards of care dropped sharply. Tales of rampant systemic abuse began to reach the media, including the burial of dozens of patients in unmarked graves in a field at the rear of the property. When these reports turned out to be true in 1991, Forest Haven was finally forced to close for good. Today, it looks like the set of a post-apocalyptic horror movie. Red telephone boxes were once seen as a symbol of Britain, much like beefeaters or black cabs. During the 20th century, there was a phone box on almost every street corner in Britain's major towns and cities. As the century drew to a close, the era of the mobile phone began, and the once iconic phone boxes suddenly became obsolete. From a peak of around 120,000 phone boxes in the late 1990s, only around 9,400 of them still remain today, most of which are no longer connected to a telephone line. The rest of them have either been scrapped or dumped on phone box graveyards. the largest of which can be found on the outskirts of London. Hundreds of old telephone boxes have been brought here to rot away, exposed to the elements as their distinctive red paint flakes away. Slight variations in the design of the booths can be tracked across the years as you walk from one end of the unorthodox graveyard to the other. It doesn't seem as if there's any plan for the future of these structures. They've just been dumped here and abandoned, and might stay where they are for the next 100 years or more. The ferocity of the Second World War made it necessary to build a lot of things that would have never been built during peacetime. And not all of those things could be repurposed after the war was over. That, in a nutshell, is the tale of Torpedonia in Gdynia, Poland, sitting off the coast in the Bay of Gdansk. Known to the Germans who built it as Torpedo Watzenplatz Hexengrund, this was a torpedo testing facility that was built in 1942 and abandoned in 1945. Back then, this part of the world belonged to the German state of West Prussia. The defeated Germans lost control of the region after the war ended, and Torpedonia was handed over to the Soviet Army to be used for military training. They didn't use it for long, and eventually stripped away all of the machinery worth saving and left the shell of the building to rot. They destroyed the pier that linked the site to the mainland as they left, but that hasn't stopped many people from visiting it by boat in the years since. There's no security, so anyone can gain access, but the building is decrepit and could collapse any day. Hidden away in a forest close to Oleshkany, North Moldova, there's a former top-secret Soviet nuclear bunker. When most people think of bunkers, they think of small, cramped space designed to be used on a temporary basis. The Soldaneshti bunker isn't like that. It's more like a whole underground city, designed to house its occupants for however long they needed to be there. The gigantic, sprawling structure is made up of 13 floors and would have been a fallback position for the Supreme High Command of the Soviet Army if nuclear war had broken out. Because it's top secret and has never officially been declassified, information about the origin of the bunker is hard to come by. But it's generally thought that it was built during the 1950s as a safeguard after Germany joined NATO, although there are some signs that it was still being added to as late as the 1980s. Work might even still have been ongoing when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s. It's known only as Object 1180 in the publicly available records of the Soviet Union, so the truth about what really went on here and whether it was ever used might never be known. In June 1889, Mount Taiwairoa in New Zealand erupted with a force never seen before in the region. It devastated the surrounding area and completely obliterated the village of Taiwairoa on Lake Tarawera. What once were fields, houses, farms, and workshops became nightmarish expanses of boiling mud, fumaroles, and toxic hot springs. Taiwairoa, which was barely 40 years old after being founded by Christian missionaries in 1848, appeared to have been lost forever. That was until 1949, when a wealthy Christian family bought the land and ordered excavation work to begin, hoping to uncover what was left of the village. They were successful. Today, the site is an open-air museum with some of the preserved ruins available to walk around and inspect for visitors. Where salvage proved to be impossible, a few reconstructed buildings have been created to give tourists an idea of what once used to stand here. The village had a population of just over 200 people when the volcano struck, so it's a haunting feeling to stand in their former homes and imagine how terrified they must have been when the sky turned to fire. Taiwairoa is an example of a ghost town that was abandoned because of a natural disaster. The ghost town of St. Kilda on Hirta Island in the Outer Hebrides, by contrast, was abandoned purely because its residents could no longer bear to live in such isolation. Far off the coast of northwest Scotland, Hirta is the most remote of all the Scottish islands. Archaeological evidence, including the discovery of Bronze Age stone tools, suggests that people lived on Hirta for more than 2,000 years before the final residents were evacuated to the Scottish mainland in 1930. By then, the local industry of sheep farming and fishing wasn't bringing in enough money to sustain the few hardy islanders who still lived there. They'd been exposed to tourists visiting by boat from the mainland Britain and discovered that Gaelic was still spoken in parts of Scotland, so they'd be able to integrate easily. By the time of the evacuation, only 36 permanent residents still remained. Before they boarded the ship that had come to take them away, each family left a plate of oats and an open Bible on the kitchen table inside their homes, some of which are still exactly where they left them today. When a castle is built for a king of England, it tends to remain standing for a very long time. Middleham Castle in Wensleydale, North Yorkshire, is a good example of this. It was built in 1190 and was still in everyday use in 1452 when future King Richard III began his childhood there. Even after Richard perished in the famous Battle of Bosworth and was deposed by Henry VII, the castle remained in royal hands and was periodically used by the royal family until the 17th century, when it was finally abandoned and allowed to go to ruin. It might not be in quite as bad shape as it is today, were it not for the fact that many stones were stolen from the castle after its abandonment and used in building projects elsewhere in Middleham. Technically speaking, the castle belonged to the Wood family from 1662 until 1889. However, the family doesn't appear to have done anything to it in terms of preservation or refurbishment in all that time. It now belongs to the English Heritage Trust, which is responsible for ensuring that the state of decay at the 830-year-old building doesn't get any worse. The Warner and Swasey Observatory in East Cleveland, Ohio, is a beautiful old building that deserved a better fate than the one it's been left to face, with its dome falling to pieces and its interior exposed to the elements. It was almost rescued from this undignified end in 2005 when a local real estate millionaire bought it and planned to turn it into a luxury mansion. But he went to jail for fraud before work could even begin on that idea. The observatory opened in 1919 and operated by the Case School of Applied Science. But they had to give up their work in the 1950s because Cleveland had grown so much in 30 years that light pollution prevented the observatory from getting a clear view of the night sky. The building was still used by academics for another 30 years, but became abandoned in 1982 when no further use for it could be found. The rot has now set in deeply, and with its current owner in jail and nobody else stepping forward to save it, it sadly seems that this former stargazing facility has a less than stellar future. Even though most of the myths and legends that surround the Bermuda Triangle have long since been debunked, there are still many superstitions about the area that prevent people from passing through it unless they absolutely have to. That means that the lighthouse at Great Isaac Cay in the Bahamas doesn't have much of a purpose, which is just as well, because it's abandoned. The 150-foot-tall lighthouse was built in the 1850s with the intention that it would actually help to prevent ships from going missing in the Bermuda Triangle. But it eventually became part of the legend that it was built to dispel. In August 1969, a relief ship arrived on the island to ferry away the 2 lighthouse keepers who'd been posted there for several months. The crew found no sign of the lighthouse keepers anywhere on the island or inside the lighthouse, and they were never seen again. Ever since then, the light at the top of the lighthouse has been automated, and nobody else has ever been stationed there. The lighthouse keepers aren't the only potential Bermuda Triangle victims associated with the island. Another legend says that a ship was wrecked there during the 19th century, with the loss of everyone aboard save for one infant child. Bahamians say that the ghost of the child's mother still roams the island looking for her baby every time there's a full moon. Where do you suppose the world's most incredible pyramid is? Would your answer be the Great Pyramid of Giza? That's a good answer, but it might not be right. The pyramid known as Ladonta in Guatemala is a strong contender for that title, but not many people know it exists. We don't blame them for that. The pyramid is almost completely covered by jungle, so it's difficult to see even from the air. Ladonta stands at the heart of the ancient city of El Mirador, known as the Lost City of the Maya. Historians believe that El Mirador was founded around 2,600 years ago and lasted until the 9th century. Although its first 3 centuries were its peak years, it's probably during that period that the pyramid was built. Measured from its base to its peak, Ladonta is 236 feet tall and has a volume of just under 100 million cubic feet. That makes it one of the largest ancient structures in the world. Unlike the Egyptian pyramids, though, there's no sign that Ladonta was used as or intended to be a tomb. Its purpose is unknown, but it must have had one. Nobody would have invested the approximately 15 million cumulative days of labor that would have been required to build it if they didn't have a very specific purpose in mind. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.